Hi. So nice to meet you all, and I've already learned so much from this conversation, including what is reflected in a quick edit to my title, which I think used to be called Data Literacy in Civics, and now it's Data Agency in Civics. So building off of some of the conversations that we've had here. And I'm going to talk really from 2 points of view, or two kind of affiliations that I have that inform what I have to say about data agency and civics in digital times. And the first is through my work at Youth Radio. How many people have heard a youth radio story on NPR? Nice. I always love coming to universities talking about youth radio. So you may have guessed from what you've heard on the air that we are a youth-driven production company headquartered in Oakland, just nearby. But we work with young people across the country. And we run a newsroom that has its base in public media. We're NPR's official youth desk. But for many years now, we have produced with young people content that runs on all platforms and across video, print, radio, and all the rest. About 6 years ago, a colleague, Asha Richardson, and I started what we call our innovation lab inside Youth Radio, which started with a focus on youth developing mobile apps, and that was in partnership with MIT's App Inventor project, which Fred is a part of. And then more recently, we've partnered with Tappan's group here and now at Cornell with Sarah and others, which is all about data science learning, data agency through journalism. And that is the part of our organization where young people take some of the very same issues and topics that we examine, whether it's juvenile justice, education, politics, and explore how to tell those stories through not only mobile apps, but web-based interactives, infographics, etc. And then the other affiliation that is going to inform what I talk about today is my involvement in a research network called the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network, which was started some years ago by the MacArthur Foundation. And that's, I think there are 8 of us who get together 4 times a year and have done so for the last few years. All of us are working on research and now an action agenda to support young people's use of digital and social media to express civic voice and agency. And so a lot of what I'll talk about today is looking at, on the ground, what young people are doing, and then what is the relevance or what are the implications of that for the capacity for young people to achieve change in their lives and in their communities related to the issues that they care most about. So equity is a driver here in at least 2 ways. One is who gets to participate and who gets to develop the kind of data agency that we seek, and then what is the impact or the effect of the products or tools that young people create once they go out into the world. And so I just want to say a word about this image. This was perhaps kind of the iconic image of when you think about youth media being made. It would be a young person with a microphone and headphones, getting somebody's story. But increasingly, you see something quite different. This is the same young man, Billy, my colleague at Youth Radio, in a kind of panopticon of storytelling, I guess is one way to look at it, where more and more young people are recording their stories and reporting their stories and investigating their stories through devices that they carry around with them and the rest of us carry around with us every day. So there's this proliferation of tools and platforms and apps that young people are using to express their civic voice and agency through data and other means. This I'll just share because it was a highlight of the year. We had this really exciting opportunity in March where NPR's Morning Edition, which is their biggest show, they have I think 14 million listeners, broadcast for 1 week out of our studios in Oakland. So David Green, who you maybe hear on the radio, came with his producer, and we all showed up at work at midnight and went on the air at like 2 in the morning. I mean, it was nuts. But Billy and everybody who you see around him were a part of making that happen, and it was a really exciting moment in our evolution as a newsroom. But anyway, when we think about the mobile devices that young people are using, as everybody in this room knows, and I think would share an aspiration, that the idea isn't just for young people to be consuming content through those platforms or through those devices, but to be actually developing tools that can expand and grow through the capacity that these devices provide. So the image that you see on the screen is of one of the interactives that our youth team developed. It's called West Side Stories, and it started out looking at one neighborhood in Oakland, West Oakland, that is experiencing really dizzying change and displacement. And it also is a neighborhood that has a really important role in Black history and civil rights history in America. So the young people came up with this concept that we would develop a map that would be populated with content that they both curated and created themselves, that would tell the story of this neighborhood, what it has been and what it's becoming, with multiple points of view, including, Black Panther Party organizers and newcomers who are migrating over to West Oakland for jobs in tech. So that range of conflicting and complicated stories is what you would find when you start to investigate West Side Stories. And what the learning looks like behind the making of a project like that is what you'll see in this slide. So, when Youth Radio first started its innovation lab about 6 years ago, we were among the very first programs worldwide that was partnering with youth in a community setting, primarily low-income youth, youth of color, to make mobile apps. So that was really hard to find. There were maybe 2 or 3 that we knew about at the time. Now, you can't walk a block in Oakland or in lots of cities around the country and not stumble across a program that is aiming to teach kids to code. And a colleague, Cliff Lee, who some of you know, and I actually have an op-ed coming out on Sunday in the Chronicle that asks the question of this community that is gathered around this idea of coding for all. We ask the question, code for what? And really try to turn the conversation towards an insistence that we need to not just teach coding for coding's sake, or only focus on this sometimes overblown promise of employability, but to really locate these programs in efforts to build technology that makes a difference in young people's lives and gives them an opportunity to advance, understanding around the issues and action and mobilization and the issues that they care about. So that's what, that's a long-winded way to say that coding is just one of these, learning outcomes that we actively cultivate among the young people that we work with. So there's a lot of focus on ideation. It helps to be inside of a newsroom because we know the beats that we care about, and we've got a basis and sources to inform what it is that young people want to build. Research takes, the form of market research, seeing what else is out there, user research, so a lot of surveying of their peers and analyzing those data. I pluralized data. Who was saying we have to pluralize data? Yeah, those data. And then a lot of content research, because oftentimes what they're building are some kind of storytelling platforms. So all of the techniques and methodologies that we know from journalism in terms of fact-checking, vetting sources, is part of what it takes to build the interactives and apps that young people are developing. Then there's the coding piece, a lot of testing. They're constantly pitching along the way to peers and colleagues through junctures where they have to make decisions, through formal demo days, and then certainly when it comes time to put their work out into the world, and lots of engagement with various kinds of experts, and of course the persistence that requires. So I wanted to, reflecting on the work of Youth Radio and the work that I've been a part of through the research network, I wanted to just identify 4 kind of opportunities or mandates for data science learning and agency, 4 things that we can think about as we start to move this field forward in an interdisciplinary spirit. And the 4 that I'm just going to touch on briefly, the first is, again, crediting my colleague Cliff Lee, who started to develop some of these ideas through his dissertation research and is now our scholar in residence, and I'm working together with him to kind of pull this notion of critical computational literacy through the work that we do, so I'll say something about that. Digital afterlife is the phrase that I've come to use when we think about what happens to young people's work once it actually goes out into the world. So it used to be in an earlier moment of youth media, if something goes out on the radio, maybe somebody writes a letter, right? And then, we got into the era of comments and reposts and different ways that people take up the stories that young people create and share them out with the world. And then there's the even higher level of digital afterlife, which is when the story is co-produced with an audience so that it continues to evolve and develop through contributions from others in the community after it's gone public. There's a trajectory of sorts from this initial investigation through public engagement, which is sort of like what I was saying, that there's the work that young people do in their own learning process, and then there is the public engagement piece and what kinds of conditions we need to create for that to be productive both for the young people and for their intentions behind their work. And then finally, this other kind of trajectory, what does it take to move from voice to agency and impact? Voice is really dominant in the conversations in the youth media world, right? So giving young people an opportunity to tell their own stories. But there are some problems with that framework and some limitations in terms of where it gets them beyond an opportunity to have a moment in the sun. And so what are some things that we know specifically about where data can play a role in moving towards that outcome of agency and impact? Okay, so critical computational literacy, again, Cliff Lee has tried to do this difficult thing, which is knit together two discourses that aren't often happening at the same time, and that is on the one hand computational thinking, and on the other critical pedagogy. So what we try to do in our production company is create and support projects where young people are developing those hardcore technical skills, but they're doing so within a community committed towards some kind of social good and some critical analysis of equity and disparities and how they play out all around the young people that we partner with. So the app that you're looking at, this is the very early stages of a project called Run for Prez, and the original idea was that our young people during the primary season realized through some user research that they collected with peers that they had this really interesting finding that they presented in a demo where they had to kind of share their user research, that young people felt very little faith in electoral politics and cared much more about what they defined as social justice, and they didn't see a connection between the two. So this was an app idea that was designed to really raise understandings among young people of what electoral politics, how it's organized, and how young people can participate in that process even when they're too young to vote. And so that was kind of the initial idea, and it's evolved from there, and we're getting ready to release a version of Run for Prez in the Google Play Store by September, in time for a lot of the ramping up towards the general presidential election. This is another app that is currently available in beta in the Google Play Store called Mood Ring. And this is an example of a project that combines the journalism that happens in our newsroom with the mobile app development that happens in our interactive team. So young people, for one of the really dominant stories that young people have reported on over years at Youth Radio has to do with social and emotional health among youth, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression associated with different kinds of life experiences that young people have. So we've done radio stories about that and print stories about that. And the interactive team really takes this solutions-based approach where their mandate is, okay, what can we build so that there's something that young people can do that gives them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. And Mood Ring is an app that invites users to track how they're feeling on a daily basis using some combination of 9 emojis. And then the app will track through these little trackers how those emotions distributed themselves over the course of 2-week increments. And then the young people are encouraged to reach out to a small network of supports whom they've identified when they signed up and downloaded the app when they're in trouble, when they're needing that help. So it's coded using App Inventor, but it's entirely based on user research. They did surveys with 70 of their peers. So for example, the functionality of this app that makes it possible to choose several of the emojis as opposed to having to pick one made their lives much harder from the coding point of view, but we knew from our user research that it had to be there because one of the markers of adolescence is that you feel many things at the same time. Okay, so that's critical computational literacy. And then the next concept is this idea of digital afterlife. So I don't know if you guys can see, this is a story that my colleague Desmond Megley reported for NPR about some research that we had come across showing the elevated risk of suicide when young people are have access to guns in the home. So there's some really powerful statistics that show elevation of that kind of risk. And so Desmond shared the story of a young man whom he interviewed as part of the story, who talks about how difficult it was and the measures he needed to take to stay safe when he would visit an aunt who had guns in her home. So the story airs on NPR, and I don't know if you can see, there's more than 1,000 comments. And so this is sort of one version of digital afterlife. And I know that it's relatively rare for young people to get that kind of, high stakes, high volume reaction. But in many ways, we see that on a much smaller scale within their own social media accounts when they have to find ways to navigate comments and pushback to what it is that they share. And and I do want to mention that this 1,000 comments is one side of an extreme. The other side is 0, which is perhaps more common among classrooms of kids who pour their hearts and souls into these projects and interactives and don't get that traction. That's its own kind of digital afterlife, right? So how do we kind of plan for that, or better yet, plan for alternatives to that outcome? And I want to mention some research out of Harvard Project Zero, which is one of the members of the research network, the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network. They've got some fairly sobering studies showing what they call a hush falling over the crowd for adolescents who start out with a really strong civic voice, putting themselves out there through digital and social media on the issues that they care about at one point in their development, and then making a decision after they've experienced that blowback to pull back and to hush their voices. So I think that's something for all of us to really be aware of as we seek impact and support young people in developing the moves and tactics that are required to stay vocal and stay visible even when the going gets rough. Okay, so the third idea related to developing data agency is this idea of investigation through public engagement. So this is a project that Youth Radio built with Sarah's magnificent local ground tool and Tappan's group. We're official formal partners, and one of the things that we built out of that partnership was this project called $5 Challenge. So the idea, just to reiterate, is that data agency is about building something that matters, would be my argument. Thank you. And sometimes that thing that matters is a kind of conversation, a national conversation. So in this case, we built this interactive as part of a series that Youth Radio was doing with NPR on the future of fast food. So we did a couple of stories for radio, and then we used local ground to put out a call through Instagram and Twitter inviting young people from around the country to share photos and caption descriptions of meals that they could buy in their neighborhoods for less than $5, which, as we all know, is getting harder and harder to do. And we specifically said, we don't want burgers and pizza, so we were looking for unexpected meals, and then we curated the content that came in through those channels and picked a range of examples and filled up this map with those stories. So it was an investigation that the young people in Oakland did in a pilot, sort of hyper-local way, but didn't have capacity to run on a national scale. So local ground, powered that ability, and a partner like NPR also made it possible for us to get a real rich range of submissions. So we actually had not that dreaded scenario of what my colleague calls it the empty nightclub. You know, when you're like, oh no, we built this amazing thing and nobody's dancing. But, you know, so part of it is thinking about, you know, how do you engage that public? And then finally, from voice to agency and impact, my colleague Danielle Allen from the Research Network has actually published an edited volume that I think has that title, From Voice to Impact. But you know, this is that question of, it's one thing to tell a story, it's another thing to kind of make an intervention through data, you know, and through media in an issue that is bearing down on the lives of youth. This was a series that we did called Double Charged, which was an investigation, a multi-part investigation into the fines and fees that young people and their families are assigned when they've been arrested, not even necessarily found guilty, but just brought into the juvenile justice system in one way or another. So for example, you know, being given one of those GPS ankle monitors costs your family $15 a day. Every night that you stay in juvenile hall costs your family X amount per day. And so we see families being trapped in cycles of poverty, and that was a story that we were witnessing among our young people because we would, you know, support them in court, and we realized that was a story that at that time really wasn't being told. There's been a little bit more attention to it recently. So, and part of that storytelling happened through radio, but part of it was through this infographic that one of the reporters in the series, Soraya Shockley, developed, which was looking into, you know, the conditions within juvenile halls and changes in staffing structures that were associated with more negative outcomes. And so this is just to show, you know, the various mechanisms that youth radio will use to tell stories. And then even going behind the scenes on that is a resource called Teach Youth Radio, which is designed to offer toolkits like the one in the left-hand corner, how to make an infographic that say, okay, you've heard the story, you've seen the infographic, now maybe you're inspired to do something, but you might not know how. So this is a whole lesson and toolkit that walks people through how you can make your own infographic, and in fact touches on some of the things we were like debating yesterday about pie charts and graphs and when to use which, and how to kind of effectively use aesthetics without going too far. So yeah, just a final thought is another term that some of us were using yesterday, which is in order for data agency to develop, I would argue there needs to be urgency in what they produce, a real sense that they have something at stake, that it needs to happen now or soon, and that it really will matter. And to do that kind of work with data in partnership with young people, I would say more and more we find ourselves really having to assess in advance what are the risks that we're willing to take on in exploring in these stories, and what role do we play in young people's lives as colleagues to them in facing those risks. How can we partner with young people to broker access to the sources that they need and to the outlets that will get their work out to real audiences? And how do we build enduring youth-adult collaborations when their work goes public? Because that's one of the things that I think is a property of digital afterlife, is that it is at our peril to devise programs or curriculum where the end of the relationship is when the story goes out into the world, because it's when the story goes out into the world that often they need adult colleagues and experts the most. If, in particular, if you think about a really ambitious data project where one of the best ways for people to undermine their credibility is to question whether they got the story right. And so we need to be with them in that process of navigating blowback so that they can continue to advance what they know to be true. Thank you.